Hey, welcome back to Evergreen Spotlight. I'm your host, Julie Holiday, and today we have a truly captivating episode lined up for you. Joining us is Feliks Banel. He's host of the thought-provoking podcast, Unsolved Histories. It explores forgotten mysteries and other little-known stories. Feliks has dedicated years to researching the mysterious disappearance of Flight 293. I can't wait for you to hear more. Let's turn the spotlight onto him. Feliks, it is so amazing to have you. And, in listening to your story and your podcast, it's so interesting, the different things that can come up that, maybe we have forgotten about or we didn't even know about. I never knew about Flight 293. I'm wondering if maybe you can fill our listeners in on that.
Yeah, and I didn't know about it either until I stumbled across it about 10 years ago. But the basic idea is this was a charter flight, Northwest Airlines, civilian crew. So, guys wearing their real Northwest uniforms and Northwest stewardesses. They weren't called flight attendants yet because it's back in 1963. And this plane, a DC-7, which was a 4-engine propeller plane, took off from an Air Force base near Seattle and headed to an Air Force base near Anchorage, with 101 people on board. It was a mixture of, that civilian crew, about 60 active duty Army and Air Force guys, and then spouses and kids and some other government employees. And midway between Seattle and Anchorage, something went wrong. No distress call, nothing. And the plane went from 14,000 feet in the air to crashing into the Gulf of Alaska with no survivors and very little actual wreckage recovered.
But they didn't find out, the families didn't find this information out because it had just gone missing, correct?
Well, it was missing they did find wreckage. They never found any bodies. They never drew any conclusions about what caused it because, this is in the era before in-flight recorders, before cockpit voice recorders, before the kind of technology that would allow the tracking of a plane constantly from the time it took off to the time it landed.
Now, you've really gotten to speak with the families. In one of your initial episodes, you talked to a younger brother of someone that was lost in the flight. And I'm curious of what it's like to talk to people that are suffering and they've experienced grief.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what this process has helped me make progress as a human being. I started working in radio when I was 22 here at the CBS affiliate in Seattle. And when I was an intern, they had me call up some poor old man whose wife had just disappeared, and they just called off the search for her on this trail in the mountains east of Seattle. Mm. And I'm this dumb 22-year-old, and I called this old man and essentially, ask him, how's it feel? And I didn't sound that glib. I saved the tape. It was so disturbing to me that I'd made this poor old man cry, and that they then put that tape on the radio 33 years ago now, I guess. That it kind of put me off of being in broadcasting because I don't really see the value in victim badgering. If somebody's wife has disappeared, how do we think that person's going to feel? Of course the guy's sad. Why have some untrained, dumb 22-year-old kid essentially call him and pester him? And so I include that tape in that first episode to kind of show the difference that I hope I have made in the 30 years I've had 30 years since that radio time of life experience and my own travails and, losing both my parents in their elderly years. And all this life experience made me a better interviewer.
Thank you for sharing that, Feliks. And you're dealing with these really tough emotions from these families who have held on to grief for so long. And I'm wondering, what are some tips that you have for podcasters out there of phrases they can say, or even us in our day-to-day lives when someone's dealing with a lot of, they feel wronged or they're crusading about something. What is something that not only podcasters, but we as humans can say to each other to really acknowledge hey, this is hard and I'm here for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of it, just my own personal experience, I couldn't have done this podcast as a 22-year-old, maybe even as a 30-year-old. I'm in my mid-50s, so I've been around. I've lived through periods of grief and trauma of my own. But I think maybe as a journalist or whatever drew me to wanting to be a journalist in the first place is just curiosity. And I don't know if you can teach curiosity or if you can pretend to be curious. When I saw that clipping about the flight that I'd never heard of, I thought, wait a minute, I need to know more about this. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought everybody needs to know about this. And it was a couple years into the process of talking to Greg and finding other family members that we figured out this notion of like, wait, these people aren't missing in action. These people are just totally forgotten. And so I guess personally for me, there's a sense of like seeking justice, trying to make sure that these family stories are told. And I guess in personal interactions, really listening. I mean, it sounds corny and cliche, but like really listening and then asking questions that are related to what someone has said, like not just having a list of questions. I decided probably a decade ago, I was never going to write a list of questions for an interview because if I was looking down at the sheet or thinking like what the next question was or trying to think like, how am I going to, then it wasn't going to be as human as I wanted it to be. And if I stumble and stutter sometimes in my questions, which I do, and I'll use tape like that just because it's me. I'm not going to fake it. I'd rather kind of spend time kind of like with the gears turning in my head, trying to ask the next thoughtful question rather than trying to fit to whatever the list of questions that I'd come up with.
I can tell you're like really affected, by this story specifically, but then you also have transitioned the show. Your first season was about Flight 293, but you've transitioned now into the other Unsolved Histories. And I'm curious if you can fill us in on other stories that you have that are coming up or that, we can listen to.
Yeah, and it's a different beast to go from a couple of years producing, crafting 8 episodes that all fit together with this really, the arc really flows and everything. You go back and fine tune. This is a little faster turnaround. The episodes are about 35 minutes long. I've been doing history on the radio for about 20 years. There's stories I've done shorter versions of before in the past in the Northwest and other parts of the country. A lot of times, like we just did one a couple episodes ago about the airship Shenandoah, which was the first big airship the Navy had back in the 20s. I met this really cool woman, talked to her on the phone, interviewed her. She and her husband started a little mobile museum in a trailer about 25 years ago where they have Shenandoah artifacts and they tow it around to schools and the 3 different crash sites and talk to people about it and show people their artifacts. That's the coolest part of my job is meeting people who are amateur historians but have devoted some part of their life to go really deep on some topic. I could talk to someone like that all day. I love those opportunities. And that's what this series tries to do. Always try to find somebody who's the expert on whatever it is we're talking about and or who has some personal connection. It was their grandfather or they have something like that. So
nice.
That's the basic premise.
And that brings me to my next question because I would love to know how you really approach your research. I love that tip too of finding someone that was invested or affected by the actual incident. But yeah, how else do you approach your research for podcasting?
Part of it's there's so much bad history out there, like Wikipedia history, where it's somebody kind of so many steps removed, essentially kind of repeating like a game of telephone. I don't want to do that. I want to do like new reporting or like source stuff that I source myself. And I'm always on the lookout for stories.
That's awesome. Feliks, thank you. How do you think that aspiring podcasters can get better at storytelling?
At KSL Podcast, we have a really cool method, which is new to me. We do group listens of a lot of things. Like you'll do a rough cut of the episode, and then this team of about a dozen or so people who are all working on their own projects will listen to it and give you critical notes afterward. And I remember sitting in on one of those when I first started with this company. Watch somebody else get their episode put through the ringer, and it was really terrifying because it was just like, at the 7:54 mark, I hear like a little sound or. I think if you took this middle part, moved it to the front, there's all these just overwhelming amount of suggestions.
Yeah.
But doing that process on the Flight 293 episodes was just improved it immeasurably. And the 12 people on the team couldn't be more different. You see these different personalities that emerge in these group discussions. And it's like a cross section of America. So you're trying, here's a sample audience. And if you don't have that kind of team, if you're a smaller operation, share it with somebody you trust. Like listen back to it with them and have them be critical and ask for their feedback. And you'll hear your own stuff too. When you're playing it for someone, you get a whole different level of awareness that you don't have when you're just listening by yourself. So don't be afraid to share it before it's released. I guess would be the shortest tip I could provide.
That is so good. I love that. The group listen, that is terrifying. Like to sit there and to listen to your work or yourself, and have it be open for feedback. So
yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's go into our rapid fire questions. Just a fun round. Don't overthink it. Just have fun with it.
Wait, don't overthink it. I don't want to do this. I want to have the overthought rapid fire round.
Yeah, I can relate for sure. Recovering over here. Okay, so rapid fire question number 1. What is your favorite go-to podcast snack? Do you snack while you podcast?
I drink a lot of tea. I think I drink a lot of tea, like lots. My mom was from England. She grew up in London. She was a little kid in London during the Blitz and emigrated to the U.S. in the 50s. And so I grew up drinking tea, like English breakfast tea with milk. So I'll drink like 10 cups of tea a day. So probably why I can't sleep so well.
A good friend of mine was from England, and we would have tea time, and wow, it was delicious. I can see why you would want to do that.
It's a way to kind of procrastinate too. It's like, oh, go make a cup of tea. I don't have to think about this. I can take like 10 minutes.
Yeah, I can put that off another 10 minutes exactly. If you had to describe your podcast in one word, what would it be?
It's unusual. It's hard to explain. It's not true crime. It's not like personality driven. It's not only about grief. It's kind of a mixture of the two. It's kind of its own thing. Everyone says that probably, but it's kind of its own thing.
Yeah, I agree. When I was listening to it, and just, hearing resilience and, the human spirit, but then also like how they're affected by these different mysteries. Yeah.
Because I love history and the stories and the details about what something, but you got to have the human element in there, because otherwise that's people won't connect with it. You want people who don't think they even care about history to care about something, and they care through the people.
And that's what I started to do when I was listening. I was able to connect with the different victims of 293, at least. Yeah.
Nice.
If you could interview any historical figure for your show, who would it be?
Why? Maybe John Lennon.
Oh, why?
I've always loved the Beatles since I was a little kid. I remember when John Lennon died, it was traumatic to be, I think it was 11 years old. It's one of the first times I held up a tape recorder and recorded sound off the radio to make a record of it. Always seemed like he had a good sense of humor, like he was very smart and also really funny and very talented. So,
thank you. Love that. And then last one, favorite historical mystery.
Favorite historical mystery? Probably D.B. Cooper here in the Northwest. The hijacked an airplane between Portland and Seattle and parachuted into the night, disappeared without a trace. All kinds of theories, all kinds of conspiracy theories. And almost every year someone crops up around the anniversary and says, that was my uncle. And it always turns out to have never been that person's uncle. It's almost like Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I hope it's never solved, because if they ever solve the D.B. Cooper mystery, it'll be like just deflating a giant blimp. It's like it's this incredible mythological thing here that happened in 1971. I remember from my earliest memory of every Thanksgiving, the time it happened, people talking about who was D.B. Cooper, how did it happen? Like it's sort of this. It was our own little thing here. It's known by a lot of people nationwide now, but he's kind of ours. And he's a criminal, right? He hijacked a plane. FBI will tell you he's a criminal. But he's like a mythical folk hero around here. So that's still my favorite.
Well, Feliks Banel, thank you so much for joining us on Spotlight. We really enjoyed hearing the heart behind your show. It's really cool. Keep going.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here.
And to our listeners, you've got to check out Unsolved Histories, and you'll hear interviews from people that were affected, the victims' families. You'll really hear that heart that Feliks so eloquently showed us today. Check it out on the Evergreen Podcast Network, and you can also check out our huge catalog of other shows that will really satisfy so many different areas of what you're looking for. evergreenpodcast.com. I'm Julie Holliday.